Welcome, welcome to Check the Energy podcast and the Vitality series, which is hosted on YouTube. Today, I am really pleased, happy, joyful, excited to be talking with Katie Rössler, who I will share a little bit of how we're connected. But of course, for those of you that don't know me, I'm Vanessa Smith, and I love to talk about energy and the paradigm shift in your purpose role within it all. And so today we're going to be exploring the topic of hidden grief and how that relates to and impacts our vitality. Through my own journey that I'll be sharing today, in addition to really exploring with Katie and her specific background, how hidden grief showed up for me and deeply, deeply influenced my vitality this year in particular. So I'm just very looking forward to this conversation. And as always, I want to give a little bit of story or context to how I know Katie, because to me, that's the juice, right? It's always interesting to hear the bio and the training and the gifts that people have. And I love that too. But I'm like, how do you know each other? Like, how did that all come together? And so I'll share a little bit, and then I'm going to turn it over to Katie and have her introduce herself in whatever way she sees fit. And then we'll go from there. So the story of how Katie and I met is actually in an online business group. And I remember at the time, this was it 2018?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Holy cow, where
Right?
time moves in very strange ways. So in 2018, I feel like I've been about 500 different versions of myself since then. Yeah, right? Like, who hasn't? And so I remember that I had volunteered to kind of lead some meetups in the group, and you were on one of them. And I distinctly remember that when Katie spoke, I was like, she has got to be a speaker, because I didn't want to actually speak, even though I was the facilitator of the meeting and needed to keep talking and inviting other people to share. Just remember thinking, please keep talking, because you are so interesting. And I love your voice. And this is fascinating. Can we just have a conversation with the two of us? So that was my first impression of Katie. And honestly, it hasn't changed very much. Like, whenever you see her online, you're like, wow, that is so fascinating, especially if you're interested in psychology and really creating balance in your life. And I want to say creating healthy relationships, like within your family, within your marriage, and then of course the topic hidden grief. So I had the pleasure of being a mentor of Katie's for a couple of years, worked with her as my client, and seeing that transformation take place, and then having her business really bloom and continue to grow. And it's phenomenal when you actually create relationships with people to see the changes that take place in them over time. It's really cool. So with all that being said, really happy to have Katie here. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you. And please, obviously, since I didn't illuminate your background with hidden grief, share a little bit about your background and just anything else you want to share about your story.
Yeah. Thank you, Vanessa. I'm excited to be on here, and I know our conversation is going to go quite deep. So those who are listening, you might want to grab a paper and pen, because I have a feeling some big things are going to come out. By profession, I'm a licensed therapist, originally from the USA. I live in Munich, Germany. And my grief journey really started after my mom died. Well, I say it's where it started, but it's where my awareness really came to light about it. And she died suddenly. And it was one of those things where Vanessa and I talked actually a couple months after I started working with you at that point. And I said, like, my compass is spinning. Like, I don't have direction anymore in my life. And all the work I'd been doing up until then, I didn't realize was a way of always trying to save my mom or save people who were like my mom. And when she was gone, it was like, well, I don't need to do that anymore. I, and so I went on this, it was really a over a year long journey of trying to understand myself in the context of life without a mom, on the planet. Really understanding grief. As a military kid growing up, I was uprooted constantly. And that had so much grief with it that I didn't realize I had not fully processed. And so it was just this realization of like, oh, my parents divorced and this and this and this, all of it had grief, and it felt different magnitudes to the loss of a parent, but the same grief. And that was the point where I started to realize hidden grief isn't something we're talking about enough. And as I started to talk more about grief, people were a little uncomfortable because grief is not a fun topic for people, right? Like, it's like, oh God, just talking about grief again. So I started to realize I want to talk about stress and overwhelm and burnout, and it's caused by hidden grief. So it was very easy to talk about it in a way that people understood, and to say, I'm a burnout specialist and I work also in hidden grief. And as soon as someone starts to work with me, that's exactly what we hit, is where's the unresolved mental and emotional baggage that is you're holding on to, that's causing grief, that is leading you to do, be, say, things that keep you in a stress mindset, that keep you in overwhelm and lead you to burnout. I've authored 2 books in the time, I'm working on a third. Like it just sort of spiraled into this beautiful way of like that compass didn't need to point north. It could point anywhere it needed to, because there was just so many possibilities to go in helping people with this. I've spoken at companies, I've spoken on stages internationally. It's really grown since the time I worked with Vanessa, of, my story being the catalyst for me figuring out how to talk to people about what they were experiencing in a way that helps them feel calmer about the darkness that they might be experiencing. And I love the analogy of a cocoon. And so when I talk about a cocoon, people are like, oh, warm and cozy, and you're in your cocoon, but also cocoon is grief. It is allowing that space, allowing a little bit of solitude and time to heal, to integrate, to become anew. And so, one of my giftings is analogies, adding humor to everything that I do, and always smiling throughout all of it. And I've been honored to work with so many people on their journey with grief, with understanding their stress cycle. And it all stemmed because I had to walk through my own fire. And I like to think of it like bringing cold buckets of water, not to make the fire go away for people, but to like soothe their feet as they're walking through it. So, yeah.
So where are you at now with your own grief?
With my own grief, it's interesting. We just hit the 5-year mark of my mom's death. And a couple months prior to that, a great uncle who was kind of like a pseudo dad when my dad left, passed away. And I went back home and I realized there's so much grief still around living abroad and finding my identity, of who am I based on my culture? Who am I based on my family? Because I have changed so much. So that is something I'm still in the process of integrating and understanding. The grief around my mom's death is still in progress, right? When somebody dies so suddenly, it allows for a lot of things to come to the surface around your fears about dying early, right? I'm a mom of 3 girls. Like, I don't want to leave this planet early for them, but I understand my story is able to develop because my mom passed in the way that she did, and the things that were able to happen afterwards would not have happened in that way. So I get that I'm a pivotal role for them, but I'm also just a part, just like how I've started to understand that for my own life. So I would say that whole thing, and as you lose someone, especially someone who created part of your identity, right? There is the who am I without them, but who do I not want to be because of them? That is the piece I'm in right now, is an understanding of looking at a parent from a holistic human standpoint. What are some of the habits or ways that she was, or my dad was, or my grandmother, or my aunt, whomever, that I don't want to be? And what are the good things I want to pull. And I'd say that's where I am in my grief journey, is just integration and more awareness of
Hmm.
what's coming up. Yeah.
Hmm.
Thank you for asking though. Most people stay away from asking, how's your grief? But it's actually a great question to ask people.
It seems like the most obvious route to go. But yeah, it can be, uncomfortable to
Yeah.
actually look at what's happening in the present moment. And I think that is one of the key factors in even identifying grief to begin with, is because you just have this sense that you're holding something, right? Like you might not even know to name it as grief, which I think is the terminology that you use, hidden grief. It's so perfect because we really have a blind spot to all of these, whether you call them blocks or densities or just unresolved issues that we're carrying around with us that impact our decision making, our
Hmm.
clarity, our confidence, our ability to be able to communicate effectively with the people that we actually really care about. There's all of these different ways that, um, you know, grief and fear and vitality are all just kind of underneath the surface in this interconnected relationship with each other. And I think it can be a really powerful entry point to just how are you now,
Yeah.
really, and I think I just actually want to commend you for being brave enough to be honest, because I think that is I want to say like the larger identity space that we're all in right now, is how can we be our most authentic expression in this moment, knowing that it's always changing, knowing that we're always growing. Like, can we create a sense of safety and security within ourselves so we can show up and just be the truth of who we are, no matter how people receive us, right? Like, there's that fear of, holy cow, if I bring grief to the dinner party, like,
Oh God, you invited that kid?
like, who's gonna want to talk to me? Or like, it's just, there's a certain heaviness associated with it, right? But like, if you can actually create space to honor it and to allow it to be, then we can create a lot of closeness with the person that is witnessing or able to receive where we actually are, with deep listening and without, and I think that's what you provide for people. I think the fact that you're calling it out, you're naming it, you're creating this really a secure container for people online and with everything that you offer up in the world, and the way that you articulate the experience and the process of grief, it helps it feel less scary, right?
Hmm. Yes.
um what I want to ask you about is, how is it connected to vitality? Because you've mentioned burnout, and I think that's something that we're all, like anybody in this day and age, is familiar with what that's about. But and we're reaching, like, how do we resolve burnout? How can we create a different experience for us in life? But it's a different question to say, how can I create vitality?
Yes.
And because you're looking in a different direction, not bypassing necessarily, but it's a kind of a different set of circumstances or a different perspective to look through. So when you're looking at, like, what do you see as the connection between the grief that we carry with us and how vital we feel in the world?
Yeah. So I want you to imagine that everyone is walking around with like open wounds on them,
Mhm.
right? Like gashes and just like raw and festering, and they bump into each other and it's like, ow, 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 like, oh, don't touch me, don't do that, don't. So vitality is not that, right? It is not like, oh, I'm like a walking, like injury constantly. But grief work and healing is really cleaning those wounds
Mm,
and allowing them to be stitched, which is painful,
yeah.
and then allowing the scar to form. So giving it time, Not saying, not rushing it. Why isn't this healed? Let me pick at the scab. No, like allowing it to heal and having the scars there. So you learn from those scars. You know, anybody who has a scar from like a sport, you're like, oh, this time in 19 da da da, I've had this injury, and we like to tell about our scars, how we got them.
Mm.
And so we have these emotional and mental scars,
Yeah.
if we allow it to heal, that when bumped into, if you've had a deep scar, then you know it's still a little numb. It's still a little like uncomfortable at times, but it's nothing like what it was when it was an open wound. And so as people get a little bit close, you might still feel it, but you don't run away from them. You don't flinch. You just
Yeah.
go like, oh, rub it on it. Okay, no, we're good. You know, I know the coping skills to help. And that is how we create vitality in our lives, is to finally allow all those wounds to close up, heal, like clean them first, clean them, stitch them, close them up, give the time, don't overdo it. You know, like, oh, I'm going to jump back into the doing this. It's like, well, that hasn't healed. And then be able to walk confidently with these scars where we're like, yeah, that happened. This is how it changed me. This
Yeah.
is how it helped me grow. That for me is vitality. So if we're not healing, if we're not working on the hidden grief, vitality is an idea.
Mhm.
It's like a dream. And
Mhm.
we can all vision it. We can all embody the feeling of that vitality.
Mhm.
But anytime we want to manifest something, like if our lives, especially an internal personal growth thing, that means you have to do the work.
Mhm.
You know, a lot of people are like, well, I'll just wake up and it'll all be gone. And I'm like, it's not like, you know, wake up and there's money in your mailbox. Like healing and personal growth is like, you still have to do it. Like, it's not manifesting money. It's not, it's like, I want to feel more vital in my life. Okay, then let's do this. Let's walk through the fire. I've got some buckets for you to help with your feet, but you got to go on the journey still. And
Right.
that's the piece where I think people love the idea of vitality, love the idea of that wholeness and alignment, but it serves them to stay walking around with the wounds. It just, it does.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I really love how you give a nod to integration and this like the space for that, how important it is, because I think well, I've noticed that in the either the holistic health world or even the spiritual approach to things, there's like, you don't have to stay in the wound so long, or you can make it shift so fast, and it's almost like a thinly disguised way of bypassing and sort of addiction or attachment to a peak moment. Like, oh, you could like just move right through it, yeah, acknowledge it, but then get right back into the game of whatever it is you want to create. You know, it's about frequency. Keep your frequency at this certain level. And I think that can be really confusing for a lot of people that are new to the healing process and new to specifically healing grief in particular,
Right.
because it is it's so dynamic, grief,
Yeah.
right? Like it isn't, it is that wound, but it's also the identity. It's also the burnout. It's also the indecision. It's also all the things unsaid with a person or a situation. And as you grow and change and evolve into these different versions of yourself, it's like you meet grief again and you respond to it a little bit differently. And it's almost like we're in this continuous dance or relationship with it. And um and I think that's a new concept for people to like really understand that it's not about making it go away. It's
Right.
just about these different levels of conversation and space for integration, and just allowing for the pause, allowing for the slowness, allowing for the rest, and really trusting your, I'm gonna say, not just trusting your body, but also trusting um how your own unique energy wants to move with the process of grief, right? Like
Yes.
we have this idea of, well, it's grief, it's heavy, we should be doing this or that with it. And it's like, no, you can do art with it. You can jump on a trampoline with it. You can,
Yeah.
you know, be intimate with your partner about it. Like there's all of these different ways. And it's just really a matter of your focus and your intention. Um, so that's what all of what you said just brought up in me. But I actually wanted to ask you about something specific in relation to grief, to my experience that I had this year.
Okay.
And because I'm curious your take on it. As you know, I'm immersed in the energy perspective, right? Like that's my wheelhouse. It's how I view life, and how I understand the underlying dynamics of all the things. So this year I had a broken tooth earlier this year. And I didn't realize that it was broken, but it was really sapping my vitality, which is like, okay, makes sense. It was broken, it was infected. I didn't realize the degree. I just knew that I felt really bad physically. Like I felt very drained all the time. And in the process of realizing it was broken, I went up and I looked on a meridian chart of what the tooth was related to, because one of the symptoms that I was having was a really overwhelming sense of grief, and it did not feel like mine. So it was a very odd experience for me because I was like, this feels very strong, intense, palpable. It's draining, and I also don't feel like it's any of my stuff. Like I feel at peace and I feel complete. And yet this wave of grief is washing over me. And so to link it back to the meridian chart, that particular tooth was related to holding grief in the body. And so the tooth was broken, and all this grief that actually wasn't mine was leaking out of my system, and I was experiencing it or kind of as if it was mine, but I knew intuitively this is not mine. This belongs to either my lineage or the culture, or there's just all of these other pieces of grief that I didn't realize I was holding that weren't my own. And as soon as my tooth got fixed, it was so, I mean, honestly, it blew my mind. The grief, it was just gone. Like literally right after my tooth was pulled out of my mouth, I did not feel grief. I felt pain, but I did not feel like physical pain, but I did not feel any grief. And it has been since that point. I mean, I'm feeling other things in general about like as we go through life, but the intensity of that grief, I'm really grateful now for the tooth because it showed me what I was holding, right? And so I'm just wanting your take on, from an energy perspective, how we hold on to other people's grief and how we can differentiate like what really belongs to us and what doesn't. What can we release from our system without needing to process it because it wasn't ours to begin with.
Right. And not internalizing, like, is there something I've missed? Like, is this
Yeah.
like what, it's easy for us to do the mind game of like, there must be something. Let me go through all the past, write all the scars. What the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10.
You know?
So, gosh, I have been studying more and more epigenetics and what is passed down to us consciously or unconsciously. And it's really powerful. There's two sides of what you shared. We've got the science side of inflammation in the body. Impacts depression. And like depression is a symptom of inflammation in the body. That's why like if you have a cold and a sinus infection, you're like, oh, I feel down, I don't feel good and stuff. It's because the depressive nature, it's not depression itself, but the depressive nature of I'm sad, I'm down, which is what we usually attribute to grief, can be activated. On top of that, you've got knowing I, Vanessa, constantly have really clear energy. Like I've been doing the work, I've been clearing things. So what is this? And knowing it's somebody else's. And when it comes to like your body, that's epigenetics all the way, right? That's powerful. And I think so many people are waking up this year and last year and even going into 2024, realizing they are the missing link to the healing process for their family lines. Like they're the ones that are going to say, no more, I'm not doing this anymore. This is unacceptable. I'm not showing up for this. And I hand it back. And it can be really hard, actually. And I'm working with a client now that releasing what she's held on to that she now realizes was her grandmother's and probably great grandmother's. she doesn't want to hand it back to them even energetically because she's like, this is heavy. I wouldn't want to put this on anybody.
Right.
And I'm like, but they're not even here. Like, they're not even here. You can hand it back. So there's our identity gets wrapped up into it, but also our desire not to hurt any family members when we need to release that grief. Um, but there's a piece where we have to respect it wasn't ours to carry from the beginning.
Yeah.
They were already carrying it. And so when we allow it to become theirs again and thank them for all the lessons it gave us, it's closure, and closure creates that vitality, and that's uncomfortable when we're, I heard someone the other day say, we will pick a comfortable hell to get away from an uncomfortable heaven. And it was like, oh, you were right. Like, we will stay with what we know, even if it's not good for us, even if it's the wrong relationship or whatever, because it's comfortable and feels safe because of the comfort.
Yeah.
Rather than vitality, which feels uncomfortable because our nervous system is not used to that. And how do you sit with that?
Yeah.
And so being able to release that with your tooth is like amazing, that it's like, oh, that was not even mine. Like, that was not even mine. Thank goodness that it like passed that quickly.
Yeah. I was really grateful and honestly quite astonished at how quick the change was, because I had been throwing supplements at, my levels of vitality. I had been, I had been doing the healing work. I'm like, okay, journal, like, okay,
Right?
ritual, like, oh, we're doing the things, we're digging in there to figure out like what this heaviness is.
Yeah.
And so to actually go through this is a nod also to the process, like to go through the painful parts of whatever it is you need to face so you can be free from it.
Right.
And I don't, okay, let's see, what is my question?
While you think, I'm going to point out, you kept
Yeah.
using the word, it's draining me. It was draining me. It was draining. That for me would be like, where in your family line did someone experience either like a physical drain? It's not something occurred because
Yeah.
you are already speaking the genetic line of where the trauma is.
Right.
And so you ask like, well, how does somebody be aware of it? If it's the words, the vocabulary that feels like, wow, I keep bringing this up and it doesn't always feel like my words,
Yeah.
or I'm keep feeling this and it doesn't feel like mine. That's the time to go like, let me go inward and go genetically, like where's that family line? Where does that make sense? So I didn't mean to interrupt your question, but I was like, oh, let me add this one thing.
Yeah. No, I think the language it's an easy in that we often overlook too.
Yeah.
And in my mind, I think, oh, right, perfect. Where do I need to seal up any drains, any leaks?
Yeah.
And then also just as an examination, whether it's, reflecting on the family members I did know or doing just a more intuitive check-in of like who was allowing drains in their own life and in what ways.
Right.
And it's interesting when you're talking about handing it back to them. I'm like, do we need to do that? I mean, so here's my question. Like when we're talking about like resolving grief and vitality, if we're going on the premise that we're coming in here to transform and alchemize the lineage, whatever the family line is and what we've been carrying, and it stops with us. Instead of handing back, what can we work with our ancestors, whether they're alive or not, but just energetically, intuitively, and say, hey, here's what I discovered. And have that sort of internal, creative, imaginative, intuitive conversation with them and say, how did this show up in your life? And let's here, I'm going to take mine off of me, what I discovered. You take yours off of you. Let's put it just in the center out in front of us and bury it in the earth, or give it up to, God or the universe, or however you experience that. But I feel like somehow that speaks to or feels more potent to me than passing it back to them.
Mhm.
I can imagine that they're like, I don't want this, like,
Right.
what are you doing? And so, I mean, I love the idea of releasing what is not yours,
Yeah.
absolutely. But I'm like, how can we, how can we liberate the not just ourselves, but the entire line? Because
Mhm.
there's part of me that says, well, they have a choice point. They have a choice point as to whether they accept what we pass back to them.
Right.
But if we can work together, and I'm just at this moment a little personally obsessed with the idea of togetherness, like, how can we work together as a collective or as a community or as a partnership to address, to become aware of, and to heal hidden grief so we can experience vitality as a collective? Like, how can we have each other's backs in that way? Like, what is the new paradigm approach to having those hard conversations, right? Like, I feel like we have a very one track mind when it's comes to healing grief or addressing hidden grief, because it's like it's heavy, here's the one way to do it, and good luck, like, see you on the other side.
Right.
So
Cry it out. Yeah.
it feels kind of like isolating, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And
Totally.
it's a very vulnerable experience to even identify where you're carrying grief. And so I'm just like, what do we do, Katie? Do we have grief circles? Do we have How do we bring it into a collective conversation where we're experiencing the transformation together, and we create
Mhm.
like a safety of container for the community, especially when there's some really crappy things going on in the broader context
Right.
that is bringing up a lot of grief for people, right? It's like,
Mhm.
I don't know,
Absolutely.
I popped off in a million different directions.
That's okay. I'm gonna try to cover it all.
Okay.
The first was I do love the idea of you and the family member or the lineage putting it all together in one and then releasing that. I think that's an excellent idea. Because we were all born on this earth and the way the world is created is there's a blame and there is a like if you're holding something, it's yours. That's for your mind to go, I'm now releasing this. So as long as even in that energetic exchange through a meditation, you're like, I'm removing this from me and you're removing it from you too. So it's no longer going up and down our family lines and we're burying it, whatever it might be, it's going into fire, into the flames.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. But for many, it is that I need to give it back to them because especially if they've passed on, it's nothing to them. It is not, it's like, oh yeah, you're right. That was like when I was on earth, that's what I was doing. Like, give that back. Like now it doesn't bother me. Well,
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah.
But we still think earthly, like, "Oh, I'm giving that back to them. They don't want it," kind of thing. It's
Mhm.
like, no. And you can, I do. I love that idea, the coming together, joining together, putting it in one place. I think that's a beautiful, beautiful way. And I agree. And I really think 2024 is about, as you've seen, the way I'm talking about things is more about couples and families. And
Mhm.
I think it is about community and it is about relationships. So how do we come together and normalize grieving, normalize difficult conversations.
Mhm.
And a couple years ago, I had wanted to start sacred grieving
Mhm.
ceremonies,
Mhm.
and it was just not the right time. Like, I was still getting people to look at hidden grief. Like, what? Nobody died. Yes, of course, but there can still be grief, right? Like, there's a change. Like, you moved, you became a parent, you got a divorce. Like, all of this has grief in it.
Yeah.
Even small identity changes have grief in them.
Yeah.
So, I needed to open their eyes to that, to, maybe 2024 is the sacred grieving ceremony year, right? Like bringing all that back. Um, we do need community. There is solitude in grief, but it quickly turns to isolation when we're not careful. And our brains will tell us nobody cares. And it forgets we're the ones that stepped back and people are being respectful of that. They just don't know when it's time to come, like, hi,
Mhm.
we're still here.
Mhm.
So there is a little bit of I need time for myself. But I think as a society, the world is craving real connection, craving being, seen and heard. and being able to offer that for other people. We've gotten really good about talking about ourselves. We've gotten really good about that social media post, conversations. Like, when you hear about people dating now, you hear that like one side of, well, I did this and I'm this and I'm that, and barely any questions. And I just think, wow, wouldn't it be amazing to start being the person who can have those powerful questions to ask and
Yeah.
reflect what you hear, and vice versa, right? Like, and vice versa. But
Yeah.
we can't do that if we're not practicing it. And that's off our phones and off the computers and in person, and getting uncomfortable together and being like, this is uncomfortable. It totally is. Let's laugh it off. Okay, let's have the conversation.
Mhm, mhm, mhm. I hope you bring those circles back. I mean, obviously do whatever is right in line for you, but if you don't do it, I hope somebody does it. I don't want to do it. But I would attend one of those circles. I just think there's um, that's that is the kind of connection that we need. There's like a deep um, not just connection to other people, but a deep sense of rootedness when you can stay in this space. I think it's of a grief focused conversation. You
Yeah.
know, it's like you completely slow down the rhythm
Yeah.
of how life is moving, and I really find that if you can stay in the conversation and walk away with it, you'll actually feel a profound sense of vitality afterwards. And it's so interesting to me. I mean, just to talk about vitality and all the pieces that it's related to, it's like we've had this very, I'm going to say, like just flat or two-dimensional approach that it equals, the self-care bubble bath or the exercise and diet. And those are factors in it. But there's this really incredible well of vitality that's always running in our system and
Yep.
it's just waiting for this opportunity, honestly, to just be expressed. And
Yes.
I have found, I mean, and I'm sure, we both in our businesses, I want to say the deep listening is really a huge component of it, like to actually be a witness and create the space for somebody else to be really seen and heard. And I can't tell you how many times I feel like the energetic life force has increased exponentially when people really feel seen and heard. And uh, to be able to do that for somebody else helps you do it for yourself, right? It's like, how much do we actually need to listen to ourselves and to what we've been holding, the hidden grief that we've been holding in our system, and how much more free could we feel if we allowed for the space for it? That is not the typical approach you would think of to creating vitality, right?
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
feel like it's a really important piece and it's a really important time to be thinking about that because of the bigness of the type of transformation and transition time that we're in between the sort of old paradigm version of how we operate and a new paradigm understanding of what life is really about and
Right.
choosing how we want to show up in it, right? And so thoughts on hitting grief and vitality.
Yeah. Well, you just drew light that it's not just physical health, that it's a
Yeah,
mental and emotional health. And I think the more we start to see emotional health a little bit separate from mental health
yeah,
is the more holistic view of vitality.
yeah, yeah. So can you tell me from your personal experience, like before we wrap up our conversation today, like how has your vitality changed and shifted? Like, what helped you, especially in relation to the hidden grief that you have had and perhaps still have? What have you done to
Mhm.
increase your vitality? And before you answer that, I do want to say like my definition of vitality is being a vital player in the game, like
Mhm. Yep.
really being whatever that looks like. It's dynamic, it's ever changing, but it's like it's playing your role.
Yeah.
Like we all know when we're kind of hanging back and not investing in ourselves, et cetera, et cetera. So But I'm curious because you've really dedicated a lot of your time, energy, focus to increasing your vitality.
Yeah.
Um, do tell.
Yes. Yeah. So this year, looking at vitality from all the different angles, this year needed to be more of a physical health vitality year for me. Again, I shared I'm a mom of 3 young kids. So I was noticing the physical draining experience of stress on me.
Yeah.
As much as I was working on balance and strategies and systems and productivity and all of these things with a business going, it was okay, something's still not helping my physical energy. And so I needed to go on that journey. And that has been amazing to learn
Mhm.
so much about myself and not to be afraid to ask questions and get tests done to get answers, and looking at it from a holistic standpoint. On top of that is always continuing to do the emotional and mental work. And um, for those of you familiar with human design, I'm a 3-5 manifesting generator, and the 3-5 like learns by doing. So everything I teach is just me learning to integrate it even more. Every time I lead a workshop on emotional intelligence, it's wiring it into my system even deeper. Every time I talk about hidden grief, I'm having realizations of my own. So if I am not out there doing stuff, if I am not talking about it, then my growth is stunted. And I've realized that.
Mhm.
When I play small, when I'm quiet about things, when I don't talk honestly about our relationships related to hidden grief or burnout or all of these things, then I'm going through it. Like I'm going to get stunted.
Mhm.
And once I realized that, it helped me understand that me showing up in my work
Mhm.
is an integral part of my personal growth as well.
Mhm. Mhm.
And it took away the heaviness feeling of it, because then it was fun. Like I love personal growth. So I was like, oh, this is fun. Like, when I say this, what do I think? I listen to my podcast. I will listen to, I do. Cause I'm like, oh, that was good. What is that? Oh, makes me think about this, because it's one thing to speak it out. And I'm like you, I don't script. I just talk. There's a topic I know I need to talk on and I just talk. But when you go back and listen to yourself, it's like you kind of remove it. This is me. And you just listen to the message and you're like, whoa,
Yeah.
I need to hear that. Right. So like I stopped with this, oh, it's me. I don't want to see myself. I don't want to watch myself. I don't want, my kids know like mom's watching herself and they'll listen too. But I'm like, I told my husband, like, this is I'm channeling some good stuff here. Like, why not take it in for myself too?
Yeah.
Because the 3-5 is here to like trial and error and learn and grow and experience and learn from themselves. And, um, people jokingly, some of my clients call me their guru. And I'm always like, oh, you're funny. But I'm like, have I become my own guru? Like, I listen
Yeah.
to these things, but we kind of need to become that if you're going to grow in any area of like, okay, like I want to know it so deep to my core. I want to understand it. I want to continue to learn more, that I feel like I could be the master of it
Yeah.
and teach others, even if you don't decide to teach them those things.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, why not? I remember a long time ago, Vanessa, like I could talk on a lot of topics. There's a lot of things I know really good. Like I'm really good at food and all this stuff. But you're like, but I choose to talk about this. But isn't it amazing to have that toolkit of all those other things you could speak on, because it's so deep to yourself.
Yeah.
But that for me is also vitality, is just having so many tools
Mhm.
that
Mhm.
you've learned and not scratched the surface of, but really dug deep into.
Yeah.
So that they're ingrained. When
Yeah.
that grief comes up, you're like, let me try this. That didn't work. Let me try this, instead of like, let me go grab the ice cream and the potato chips. Like you might do that, but then you go, and now I'm going to go for that walk so I feel better after this.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
I'm going to do the things now I know that help me feel like the
Mhm.
grief is being processed rather than keeping it stuck inside of me.
Mhm.
Yeah, so mine has been mainly physical, and then just the realization that yes, of course I need to take breaks, but for the most part I need to be out there speaking. I need
Yeah.
to be talking about it, because my growth is dependent on that too. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. That was a total pleasure for me to hear you say all of that for multiple reasons. One, that was a mirror because I totally watch my videos and I do. I love it. I'm like, that was really good.
Right?
And my husband and my son do the same thing. They're like, okay, she's listening to herself again. But at this point, my husband will also watch and he's like, you should watch this again. You should watch yourself again. This is really good. So I really relate to that. And also I love that you articulated how vitality is so closely connected with doing your purpose work, right? Doing the things that you feel called to do and
Mhm.
doing the things that you feel called to learn. That is, I'm going to say, just very foundational to the core of my own values and standards. And I want to say something that I'm losing my headset here. Something that I like to impress upon everyone that I work with, like the importance of showing up and sharing, not just because there are people here to receive your transmissions, but also because that energy is meant to move through you, right? Like it enlivens you, it clears you out, it sets a new standard for yourself. You are absorbing all of these incredibly profound messages that you are sharing. You're literally engaging in the rewiring process. And so, and I find too that when we're operating at that level, that is both simultaneously addresses the vitality, kind of like opens up. It's like, I don't know, it's like taking a perfectly warm shower but on the inside, or like it
Mhm.
just it opens the door for vitality, but at the same time it also, I find, is very, like, our purpose work is very potent for grief work
Yeah.
too. It's just
Yep.
because we feel so expansive in the expression of our own aligned calling, that we then see these pockets of hidden grief. We can see things that we didn't see before because we're operating at a different perspective when we're in our purpose work, right? We're like, oh, that's there. And oh, that doesn't mean this. That actually can mean something different. Now we see it from these new points of view. And so that was a beautiful bridge, is my bottom line, between hidden grief and vitality, and how your purpose work and really allowing yourself to be in the grace of that is can be profoundly healing for vitality and for hidden grief. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Yes. And I feel like I could very easily double the time of this conversation, but I want to respect our time here. So say thank you, Katie, for joining me today in this conversation. I know it's been a bit and some change since we had any conversation. So grateful that you said yes to coming here today. And also tell all the people where they can find you, what you're up to,
Mhm.
promote all the things.
Thank you. Again, thank you for this conversation. Like I said, I was like, this is going to be some good stuff that's going to come out. So, if you would like to connect, you can go to my website, katierössler.com. Instagram is katie.rössler. My podcast is The Balance Code. You can find it on YouTube, Spotify, Apple. It's on all the places. So you can go to katierössler.com/positive connections. I'll make sure Vanessa has a link to share. And that is a great way to, to do some work in your relationship. There's lots of other things I always offer if people want to come and work with me, but I would just say find me on social media on my website and connect.
Thank thank you. And thank you to everyone that tuned in today and listened to the conversation around hidden grief and vitality, and little bonus points on the power of your purpose work from these new paradigm perspectives and energetic contexts, and doing healing for our lineage, for ourselves, for the collective. So this is a really powerful, potent work that I invite you to engage with, because it is there and it is real for us. And our vitality is not just right around the corner, it's actually existing within us right now. And when we can give space to releasing what we are holding on to, that vitality can really move freely. And having had that experience this year, I can't implore you more to take it for yourself. So with that, I am going to end this conversation, and we'll be back soon with another wonderful guests like Katie. And please do check out her stuff. Really, like, as you could see, you could sit there and listen to her talk about all of these things for a very long time. Just telling you the truth there. So thanks again, Katie. And I am going to sign off now. Take care. Smoothly.